Good morning. My name is Lunia Masuku, and I'm the director of RUSI's Nairobi office. I've had the pleasure of being the Strive team leader for the final months of the program. Today, we are pleased that you are joining us for the final conference on Strive 2, Closing Lessons Learned and Evaluation. Before we begin, I am going to share a few details about RUSI Nairobi and our programs. RUSI Nairobi was incorporated in 2014 in order to support the Strive Horn of Africa program in Somaliland and Puntland that helped build the knowledge base for the European Union in countering violent extremism programming in the Horn of Africa. My colleague Martine Zuthen, who will join us later, will tell you a little bit more about that program. In the intervening years, RUSI Nairobi has worked on a number of countering violent extremism research and implementation programs in the Horn of Africa for a variety of organizations and continues to focus on countering violent extremism work in the region. Namely, we are currently working on the CVE workstream of the Reinvent program, an FCDO funded program aimed at reducing insecurity and violent extremism in northern and coastal Kenya in a consortium with Tetra Tech and the Danish Demining Group. We are also at work on a project funded by the Netherlands Embassy in Nairobi that has a focus on student-led CVE for Kenyan universities. In a moment, Martine will give us an outline of today's program. In the meantime, please allow me to introduce Professor Malcolm Chalmers, RUSI's Deputy Director General and the Director of Research, who is joining us from the UK. Over to you, Professor Chalmers.
Malcolm, you're on mute.
Okay, let's start again. That's a good start, isn't it? Welcome to RUSI, everybody. RUSI is a defense and security think tank, an international think tank, but a UK-based think tank. And we are absolutely delighted to have been the host for the Strive program for the last several years. Terrorism and violent extremism, of course, are wide and imprecise terms. Academics love to discuss exactly what they mean, but the phenomena they seek to describe are real ones. Their causes are deep-rooted, complex, and ever-changing here in Europe as well as in Africa, and their impact is a real one. Terrorism and violent extremism sow divisions, they foster instability, and we've seen too many cases in recent years in which terrorism has been used to prepare the ground for larger scale military offensives which destroy existing states. We've seen that in Africa, we've seen that in the Arab world, and we've seen it elsewhere. So it's in the interests of both citizens and governments who are directly affected by these phenomena to work to combat terrorism and violent extremism. And it's also the case that terrorism in one place can have an impact elsewhere in a world where travel has been, at least until this pandemic, common, but also in which ideas move very rapidly from one corner of the world to another, and not least in Europe, where some of the events in Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia sometimes seem far away. There is an impact, and very often some of the extremism in our countries is inspired by events in other parts of the world and furthers their ambitions to divide and destabilize our societies, as seen in attacks in London, Paris, Brussels, and elsewhere in Europe. But if terrorism is multidimensional, adaptive, and often highly strategic, then so too must be the response. Wanting to stop it or to control it is a given, but how to do so needs careful analysis, planning, and delivery. You need to understand the problem, you need to understand the best ways of responding, but you also need to implement that. And in many ways, that speaks to RUSI's traditional strengths. As a policy think tank, we're not an academic institution, we're not interested in ideas only for the sake of them, but as a way of contributing to the improvement of policy in a whole range of issues related to defence and security, including this one. And that's why you'll hear from the rest of this seminar ways in which the Strive Horn of Africa programme, the first EU-funded programme in this region on CVE, has been working to generate careful study of different ways of responding to violent extremism in this region and generating lessons about what works and what does not. It is not an easy area in which to work and achieve real results, and you're going to hear what has been found as a result of the research in the coming couple of hours. And finally, can I emphasize that what we're doing supporting the Strive Horn of Africa programme is very much part of a wider RUSI portfolio of work on counterterrorism and PCVE, especially in relation to Europe and Africa. And I think one of the things we've learned a lot from Strive, which we've been able to apply elsewhere, and I hope vice versa. And my colleague Emily Winterbottom, who heads our terrorism and conflict programme here in London, may well say something about that later. So finally, Lunia, I'm conscious of time. Can I finally, really on behalf of RUSI as a whole, extend my thanks to all those who made Strive possible. At the European Union, of course, the previous contract manager, Hanina Ben Barnou, and of course, Alina, who you'll hear from in a moment, but actually all those at the European Union who have put their faith in RUSI, work very closely with us on this programme over many years now. Thank you very much to them. Thank you also to the director of NCTC, Ambassador Kimani, who's been a stalwart supporter of the programme throughout. Thank you to our consortium partners, GTZ, Red Cross, AKF, and indeed all the researchers and academic institutions who have worked with us. Thank you, not least to the many community members, including stakeholders in the mentorship programme, the youth we worked with, very much on the front line, sometimes taking quite considerable risks in combating this pernicious phenomenon. Thank you very much to them. And of course, thank you finally to our RUSI team in Nairobi, supported of course from London and Brussels. That has made Strive a success and made this event possible. You're going to be hearing from all of them in the next sessions, but I'd like to give a particular thanks to Martine for leading this effort from the start to the finish. It's not been possible without you. The success of the programme is in large measure down to you as well as other colleagues, and also to Lunia for so ably taking over the reins of leading RUSI Nairobi. One of the positive, if unintended, consequences of lockdown and moving so much of our activity online is it's provided new opportunities in RUSI for us to work even more closely together between London and Nairobi. And indeed the migration of events such as this to a virtual format has actually had pluses as well as minuses, not least by allowing a wider range of participation from those who would have been unable to make the trip to Nairobi if this event had been held there rather than virtually. So thank you all. I look forward to a really interesting discussion. Over to you, Lunia.
Thank you so much, Professor Chalmers. I really appreciate you contextualizing the event and highlighting all of the important people that have made this program possible and the success that it has been. I'd now like to introduce Alina Neakshu, who is the Strive 2 current program manager. She's a program manager in governance and macroeconomic section of the European Union delegation in Kenya. She's going to speak briefly about the EU and their CVE priorities. Over to you, Alina.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to see so many of you join this event. I do hope I'm audible. We do have some works next door, so let's hope this doesn't interfere with the sound. Unfortunately, our head of cooperation, Hubert Pell, wasn't able to join. He really was. He would have liked to join, especially that he's been from the beginning the creation of Strive 2 in Kenya. Allow me first to start by congratulating RUSI on running this important milestone in the project under these new circumstances, and let us hope that no technical glitches come up And as it is suited with a closing event, it would be good to apply a bit of retrospective approach and look back at the past 4 years, and to maybe touch upon of why we started doing what we're doing. Preventing violent extremism was put on the agenda with the migration crisis in 2015. 1 second. Yes, sorry. Working from home and online schooling is interfering. So I was telling you about the agenda of preventing violent extremism, which was put in the 2015 with the migration crisis. Each of the countries that was touched upon was able to identify which area of the migration crisis could be tackled. And in Kenya, we chose to dedicate a good portion of the funds received exceptionally from the European Trust Fund on addressing underlying causes of conflict, in particular areas of Kenya, which were at risk of violent conflict and forced displacement. And through our targeted interventions, we aimed our programs especially at the youth, and we sought to address factors that that have the potential to motivate youth to resort to violence, including their grievances such as the lack of opportunities or inequality and poverty. The European Union and its trusted partners, and in here we obviously include the RUSI and its program Strive, based in interventions on 3 premises. So first, we try to achieve a better understanding of the underlying causes for conflict and violence. And this is absolutely paramount because we didn't have enough knowledge to cover this information. Then we focused on the young people and on giving them access to better vocational educational opportunities. And the aim here was to reduce their vulnerabilities, to enhance economic stability, and to bring about the sense of positive peace. And thirdly, our interventions focused on attitude change and to create political solutions to grievances and a close working relationship with the government to improve Kenyan security. And this is a pillar that is an ongoing discussion, and it's still ongoing, but we achieve results every single day. Now, looking back on the ad hoc consortium, although almost casual, created a very good balance between these interventions. And we have learned, and Strive has definitely been instrumental in this exercise, that combining mentorship programs with livelihoods and trainings is a better match with increased possibility of success. We are now sad to see that 2020 has brought not only COVID, but also has brought this consortium to an end due to our depleted funds. And we would be very sad to see the interventions of RUSI, both EJZ, Kenya Red Cross and Aga come to an end. We have learned a lot, and this is why we are here now and pleased to come to reinforce the European Union's side and recognition. Allow me now to mention a few of the achievements of Strive 2 that we really hold dear to our interventions. And we've noticed you've managed to strengthen the voice of the youth. You've managed to talk to youth that we would not otherwise have talked to. The mentorship program, which provided the ability for introspection and reflection, and it gave us a lot of food for thought. And a very good balance between studies and the trainings in the field. And now speaking of the trainings, of course, the very high quality trainings that you've undertaken in Kenya. Now, at this point, we would normally talk about future. We are at a very important crossroads between our commitments, financial commitments, as 2021 will see a new instrument being decided. Of course, COVID has brought a bit more hurdles to this already quite political battle. So we do not have yet a clarity. Well, we cannot promise we will have means to finance pure CBE programs, as useful as as we know very well they are. The Strive experience has shown us the importance of factoring CVE narrative in any development programs, especially in the areas we have been working jointly. And this is, I tell you with a whole honesty, we weren't quite geared to do, and now we probably will apply a more CVE lens to everything we do in these particular areas in Kenya and not only. And the studies that RUSI has produced on the Kenyan context are very high quality and very insightful documentation that will definitely inform better programming, not only from the European Union, but also from our partners in Kenya overall. With that, I finish my intervention. I hope I covered everything you had wanted me to say. I'm available for any questions, and hopefully the noise will stop from my end.
So then I think, Lunia, it's back to me, yeah?
Yes, thank you, Alina, and over to you, Martine.
Great, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Alina, thank you, Malcolm, and thank you, Lunia, for your introductions and opening remarks. My name is Martine Zeuthen, and I'm a senior research fellow with RUSI, and I was the team leader on Strive Horn of Africa, and for the first 3 years of Strive 2. So first, what I wanted to do was to kind of give you the plan for today's meeting. So in a moment, I'm going to give a quick background on Strive 2 and then move swiftly to the presentations by the program managers. And they will share an overview of the lessons we learned in each component. I should say at this point that we have a lessons learned document that is ready to be shared with all of you and will be uploaded to our website during the course of the day, but we'll share it with you also by email in due course. So after the team's presentation, we'll have a short Q&A, and that will be followed by a quick break with a couple of videos done by the mentorship team to give you like a flavor of that work. After the break, I'll hand over to our colleague Emily Winterbottom, who's the director of RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Group. And she will then come in and facilitate the briefings from the team of external evaluators of the program, as well as manage a Q&A of that session. And during that Q&A, both the evaluators and the program team will be able to respond to any questions or discussions that might come up. So let me now move the conversations forward and dive into kind of Strive 2. As we've just heard, it has been funded by the EU and it started in 2016. It actually ended in 2019, but then was extended with 1 year to now 2020. And as both Alina and Malcolm also mentioned, Strive 2 grew out of EU's first CVE program funded overseas, which was called Strive Horn of Africa. And Strive Horn of Africa was kind of essentially a series of pilot activities. And I don't want to dive into it much, but again, if you're interested, the lessons learned documents and external evaluation are publicly available, so you can find it there. But what I do want to say is what we learned from Strive Horn of Africa was kind of brought forward into Strive 2, and it helped us identify our 4 primary intervention areas, namely the mentorship component, the support to law enforcement and security agencies, the research component, and the preventive communication component. We also had quite a strong effort on M&E, which we've decided to discuss more in the second session of today. Yes. What these 4 components kind of indicate is that violent extremism is a very complex problem, as Malcolm was saying, and that it needs to be addressed from different perspectives. And of course, I think the approach that we've taken also shows that RUSI is a think tank, so we have a great emphasis on research, but also that we are defense and security think tank, so we are, you know, able and willing and have history in engaging with those issues. So in summary, kind of working with both youth at risk as well as law enforcement and security actors was critical in our theory of change, recognizing that we have to address both aspects, combined with the need for researching and understanding the dynamics better around recruitment and radicalization. And the preventive communication aspect was kind of more cross-cutting, and it was particular focus through a media lens and on youth empowerment, where it was trying to address some of the barriers of getting young people's voices into mainstream media in Kenya. Finally, I should say, just as what Malcolm and Alina mentioned, the program was implemented as a part of a consortium with GIZ, Red Cross, Kenya Red Cross, and Aga Khan Foundation. And what to me was really great about this was that we had very different areas of expertise and strength. And our consortium partners were really strong on livelihoods and support to vocational training of youth. So we ended up through the collaboration to be able to expose, if you want, some of the youth in our program to some of the efforts done by GIZ through KPA and Kenya Red Cross. And we can see in our M&E data that the youth really appreciated this approach. Now, let me move into the heart of the program of today. We have the 4 managers who've been leading the work with us today. It's my great pleasure to invite them all to share their insights. I think I'll be inviting them one by one as they speak. And I should say that we've agreed that they will, in very brief terms, kind of say what we did in terms of activities, but then kind of emphasize on lessons we learned. And then when all of the managers have shared their remarks, we'll have a short Q&A. So just as you can see, if you have any questions, please try and type them into the Q&A box, and I will try and monitor and make sure we answer as many of them as possible. So with that, Khadija, I hope that you are ready. Khadija Suleiman, she's the manager of our mentorship program, and she will be making the first remarks on this panel today. Over to you, Khadija.
Thank you, Martin, for that introduction. My name is Khadija Suleiman, and I'm the Strive 2 Mentorship Manager. Strive 2 Mentorship focuses on individual case management of at-risk youth through peer-to-peer mentorship. The stakeholders in this case, who are a diverse team of social workers, parents, peace committee members, teachers, among others, identify the at-risk youth, who in this case we refer to as mentee, and refer them to the program. The stakeholders also offer support to mentors, share security information, as well as livelihood opportunity. We came up with a selection criteria for the mentee, and that includes youth who are associated in one way or another to gang or VE group, hold radical view, or have a family member or peer who has joined VE group. This is then coupled with the secondary criteria, such as school dropout, youth who comes from a dysfunctional family background, former convict, or someone who has just newly converted to Islam. These secondary criteria inform the level of vulnerability of the youth, but for a youth to be to join the program, they have to have at least one of the 4 primary criteria. The mentee is then matched with a mentor based on a number of criteria, which includes gender, age, geographical location, religion, profile, among other factors. Then the mentors are selected based on their involvement in community work. We also look at the age group. They have to be within the same age bracket as the mentee or slightly older and more experienced. They have to come from the same neighborhood or location as the mentee, but have outstanding character and have been able to overcome some of the challenges that the mentees are struggling with. We tried to ensure the gender representation for the mentors is 50-50, while for the mentees, the number of the males is slightly high due to high numbers of males being targeted and recruited into VE. Some of the support we've been giving the mentorship team is the one-on-one meetings between the mentors and the mentees. This one ensures the mentor supports the mentee on an individual basis, that is in terms of setting goals and sharing personal experiences. We have the group meetings where the mentors and mentees meet, discuss current issues and share experiences, and also build alternative positive support network. During these group meetings, we felt the need of having structured discussion around VE, and we came up with a manual which is ready, and Martin will be able to share with us the details on that. We had also gender-specific sessions to discuss issues that can't be discussed on general group meetings. Additionally, we also created a WhatsApp group that is online engagement to ensure that there's continued discussions after the face-to-face meetings. And we continuously tried to build the capacity of the mentors and the stakeholders to make sure that they are well equipped in terms of knowledge and skills to support the mentees. And on a monthly basis, the stakeholders met with the mentors and project team to discuss security issues and also share opportunities within the community. And the last two support we were giving is we tried to link the mentees with opportunities available within their neighborhood. So we tried to link with organizations that offer vocational trainings, life skills, scholarship, and employment opportunity. This is part of effort to address the socioeconomic challenges faced by the mentees. And finally is the psychosocial support, where the mentors had a debriefing session with a psychologist. This is to reduce the risk of the secondary trauma among the mentors as they are exposed to mentees' experiences. And also she offered this support to mentees, but on need basis. Some of the achievement for this program is we've made very positive efforts in making the mentees aware of the implication of propaganda and recruitment to violent extremist organization. We've seen like understanding about radicalization, VE, and how people are recruited into these organizations. And we've also seen some positive changes in terms of life skills, their critical thinking, self-esteem, among many other things. The other thing that has worked well for us is the mentor-mentee matching. We came up with the criteria for this, and we realized that the right match of mentor-mentee is key to success. So we considered peer group, are they within the same age group, the neighborhood, religion, background, gender, and preference, among many other things. That thing that also worked for us is in terms of sustainability and also consistency, the established relationship or network among the stakeholders, mentors and mentees, appears strong, and we can see that it can potentially be sustainable beyond the end of the program and provide alternative network to VE. Additionally, the consistent training has built the skill of mentors to continue with the work. Some of the challenges we've observed is attitude towards violence has not changed as much. One of the major challenges being them trying to justify that violence in case of self-defense or defense of others is justifiable. But this is contributed given the high incidence of violence in the areas where the mentees resided. And we felt a more context-specific engagement when it comes to violence was required to encourage a better understanding. Secondly, in terms of matching, the mentor-mentee matching, taking into consideration all those criteria that I've mentioned, getting mentors from the same neighborhood as mentees with those qualities can prove a challenge. So if it's a mentee with with radical view, it could be difficult to get a mentor who has strength to handle such cases within the neighborhood. So we also encourage, capacity building of the mentors. The third challenge that we faced is when to end mentoring, and this cuts across most mentorship activities. So mentors, for our case, mentors together with mentees established goals, which the mentor can help identify when the mentee is ready to leave the program, combined with judgment based on individual circumstances. And lastly is challenge of identifying the right stakeholders. If you don't get the right stakeholder who does understand the program, it will be harder to identify mentees, as well as approach them, or they might end up giving them wrong expectation. So in regard to this also, thorough training is important. And then finally, in regard to recommendation, it's important to focus on the capacity building of the stakeholders who are key actors in this mentorship project, because they're the ones who refer the mentees, and also on mentors who build on a case management approach. Secondly, when organizing meetings and trainings and different activities, it's important to engage the mentees. Direct engagement is key also to maintaining motivation during and ensuring quality of intervention. Thirdly, it's important also to diversify the meeting and training. This reduces monotony and makes it enjoyable for participants. For our case, we used a lot of role plays, scenarios, and even activities like yoga to bring out some of the points that we wanted. The other point is it's important to complement mentorship with livelihood intervention. Is effective, and the social change was significantly enhanced when we complemented mentorship with the livelihood interventions. The other point is it's important also to identify and continue to understand the risk associated with the program. Additionally, to have deeper engagement, to have positive attitudinal effect. So it's important to make discussions around violence to be more locally grounded, and also to undertake deeper engagement on attitudes towards violence. And finally, to ensure or create continued engagement between mentors and mentees after the program has completed, it's important to come up with inexpensive way of continued discussion, like the WhatsApp group that we created, as well as equipping the mentors and the stakeholders with enough skill to continue with the mentorship work. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hadija. I think you managed to capture everything very well and highlighted how it's kind of still learning as we go, but we really have come far. I just wanted to pick up on what Hadija said, that if any of you are looking to do or already doing mentorship work, we have published a manual which will be uploaded, during the course of this week. For you to consider or consult with or use in any way that might be useful to you. Yeah. So thanks again, Hadija, and to the team for all of this work. Now I want to move to our work with law enforcement and security actors, which was skillfully led by our colleague Galgalo Apagaro, the manager of the law enforcement component. Galgalo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction, and warm greetings to our esteemed audience. I'm pleased to briefly share with you our approach, achievements, and key experiences that we've gained over the last 4 years of engaging law enforcement agencies in CVE trainings. Maybe to start us off, the logic that underpinned these trainings was that enhancing knowledge and capacity of these officers strengthens their roles, particularly in prevention of violent extremism, improves their quality of responses to violent extremism, and ultimately support strategy and counter-action plan implementation and boost collaboration between non-state actors and security actors. With this in mind, we were able to design a flexible, intense, but short program that iteratively considered changing dynamics and local context. And we were able to implement these trainings in at least 11 counties of Isiolo, Mandera, Wajir, Garissa in the north and northeastern region, Tana River, Lamu, and Kwale in the coast, Nyeri in the central, and Nakuru in Rift Valley, and finally Siaya and Kisumu in Nyanza. These trainings were supported by a custom-made CV manual, custom-made for the security officers, and some of the key topics that were covered included roles of the officers in prevention of violent extremism, understanding terrorism and violent extremism, including radicalization and recruitment, vulnerabilities, risk assessment, human rights, engaging of public and non-state actors, and disengagement. And as a result, we were able to reach out to over 600 officers drawn from 8 regions of Kenya, 11 counties, and in total 56 sub-counties. And these participants were drawn from the security and intelligence committees. Now, one key factor that made these achievements possible is the stakeholder engagement that we carried out. Of course, the significance of stakeholder engagement in any CV engagement is well grounded and under public knowledge. However, our creative approach of co-engaging the subnational stakeholders together with our national stakeholder, which is NCTC, and again, which is the state's CV agency, helped us in getting priorities right, making trainings adaptive and responsive, and also opened up doors quite faster and easily at the local levels. And of course, we carried the national goodwill and support to the local levels. In addition, based on the feedbacks that we've had from the participants, the trainings were very useful, particularly for those in the target counties that we were able to conduct these trainings in. Our program, like many other past and ongoing CV initiatives in the country, focused more in the hotspot counties that I mentioned earlier. However, with radicalization and recruitment spreading to non-traditional areas, and new hotspots potentially arising, one of the key observations that we made out of engaging them is that all officers in all the counties should be considered for future capacity buildings or even ongoing capacity buildings. Of course, this has a bearing on resource and sustainability, and one of the key suggestions that we made is that to make this, to enhance this kind of sustainabilities in CV capacity building programs, the programs should be mainstreamed in the basic or, for instance, staff level officer trainings, and it should be done at catchment areas like training colleges, so that sustainability issues can be addressed. Secondly, CV space generally is securitized in Kenya, and in some cases, this CV is seen more as a security function, and there is generally low trust between state and non-state CV actors, and also a lacking confidence in each other's roles, which is further affecting the desired whole society approach that the whole globe is looking forward to. In our case, it was quite a challenge to include non-state actors in the program as we initially desired, and this is partly due to discomfort and sensitivities from the security officers. However, for a genuine whole society approach to be achieved, government security agencies and officers must appreciate significant roles of non-state actors in CV and deliberately engage them, to build trust and strengthen collaborations. Thirdly, it is ideal, of course, to have gender representations when engaging a security sector like any other sector, and particularly when engaging on issues of security. Women also have a critical role to play in this. However, in hardship areas and in conflict-affected localities, achieving that ideal gender representations can be challenging. For instance, in our case, the total participants in 11 counties were less than, women participants in 11 counties were less than 1% of the total participants. 4 out of 11 counties had 0 representation, and these are, counties in the northeastern region, basically the frontier, the VE frontier counties. And of the 11 counties in total, only 66% of them were women participants from 3 non-traditional counties of Nyeri, Siaya, and Kisumu. This only means that a few of them hold such important posts, especially in majority of the VE affected counties. As such, when in the initial stages of programming, a deliberate inclusive criteria should be considered so that women cannot be left out of such an important initiative. And finally, A robust and inbuilt monitoring and evaluation and feedback system helped in continuous improvement of our content and delivery style. And in our case, particularly identification of participants' expectations, pre and post-training surveys, endline surveys were quite useful in improving how we delivered these trainings. But of course, my good colleague Teresa Sahgal will be speaking about this shortly. Thank you very much, and I hope to answer one or two questions in the question and answer session. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gargalo, for this excellent overview. Let us move swiftly to Gayatri Sahgal, our colleague who has been the manager of the research and then the M&E component of this program. Yeah, over to you, Gayatri.
Thanks, Martin. Thank you. And I'll be talking about the research component of the STRIVE program, which essentially aimed to address the limited availability of evidence in the locally specific drivers of VE in Kenya. The implementation strategy that we essentially followed was to work with Kenyan researchers and academics who had experience in conflict and terrorism studies and to support the local generation of knowledge. We also sought to ensure that research findings were disseminated widely and made available through publicly accessible platforms. So we focused, a lot of our work also focused on the publication aspect of the research studies. And thirdly, we lent capacity building support and advice to the researchers in developing both the scope of their methodology as well as the implementation and the design of the studies. So the main areas of research that we supported was the role of women in violent extremism, the role of external actors in violent conflict in Northeast Kenya, the relationship between crime and violent extremism, and the relationship in coastal politics and violent extremist activities. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the achievements, but I think the evaluators will speak more in detail about the impact. And so just more in terms of the outputs. The program supported 10 studies cutting across all 4 research areas, and this was much more than the original target of 4 studies. And in particular, the specific findings of some of these studies, which I think might illuminate to the extent to which we were able to achieve our primary objective, was that, for instance, the role of women study, we focused on the role of women in violent extremism in partnership with the French Institute for Research in Africa. And we tried to unpack essentially the gender-specific dimensions of involvement and engagement in VE. And this is an important lacuna within VE research, which tends to pit women either as victims or as peace builders, and fails to sort of recognize their role as perpetrators and supporters of violence. And through the research study, for instance, we focused on the role of women in their recruitment patterns, their involvement in VE groups, the types of roles that they played, and finally also the differentiated impact of VE activities on women versus men. The clan study, for instance, focused on the Northeast region, which has been considered a hotbed of extremist activity, but a lot less is known about how clan dynamics are implicated in violent extremism and how violent extremist groups tend to exploit clan dynamics. And to support this research, we worked with researchers at Garissa University, which had actually personally experienced this violence, and in some ways were therefore invested in exploring these dynamics. And so some of the key findings that we found was that external groups like Al-Shabaab definitely do use clan dynamics to further their aims, but in fact the patterns tend to vary, and it's important to have a differentiated approach when looking at the specific counties. For instance, looking at Garissa and Wajir versus Mandera. The third study focused on crime and violent extremism. And again, I think this has been a topic of much research and much policy debate as to whether there is a link between criminal groups and violent groups. And of course, the link is somewhat implicit in definitional terms where you say that violent extremism is a type of violent crime. So of course, they must be linked. And in fact, to understand this linkage, we were again supported by the Kenyan Prison Service, who allowed us to explore these dynamics in the context of a prison environment. And in the end, what we found was that, in fact, the link is quite tenuous and it's very context specific. And we found that there were some instances of radicalization within the prison context, but not so much of an overlap at an individual level or more organizationally. And in fact, those overlaps were also determined, were much more contextually contingent. The fourth research study focused on Kwale's particular challenges, and Kwale, I think, is those who are conversant with Kenya know that has been often considered as a hotbed of extremist activities, and all sorts of groups and dynamics are implicated in this. And so our research tried to disentangle the groups and their particular involvement, and we focused on one group, Alasuna, and try to understand what was driving their extremism. And the research, which involved primary level research, in fact found that there was actually a loose connection between Al-Shabaab and Al-Sunnah members, and that their extremism was in fact driven a lot more by local tribals. So what have we learned through this entire process? I think some of these learnings are, the first big learning, of course, is that we're working with researchers with varying capacities. And I say this only to point out that terrorism and conflict research is somewhat of a new area, especially CVE style research. And so there are varying capacities. In Kenya, the researchers tend to be concentrated in Nairobi and to some extent Mombasa. But these are also not the only counties experiencing this kind of violence. And so we realized that we needed to work with groups which are outside these areas and also work with them in a supportive context. The second aspect I think that we also considered was the sensitivity of the research. Again, not specifically new, but what we found was useful was to talk about the particular issues of violent extremism that in the language in which they were expressed at the local level. And by this, I just mean that the patterns are quite different. And so given that we're working from the coast versus the northeast, we needed to be quite contextually grounded in our definitions of how we were defining violent extremist activities and which were the particular groups that we were referring to. The third aspect was the methodological rigor. We realized that our questioning was much more qualitative in nature, and that given that it's quite difficult to sample violent extremists, a qualitative approach may have been, was beneficial. And in fact, we followed a purposive design as a consequence. Fourthly, we realized that there is a lot of respondent fatigue. And by this, this is a particular bias that arises when there are lots of programs and a lot of researchers doing similar research. And so this is also why we worked with organizations like the French Institute for Research in Africa, which actually was extremely beneficial to us because it allowed us the opportunity to conduct more research, but with limited budget. So we were able to produce 4 studies when in fact we would have only produced 1 or maybe 2. And lastly, there is a need for policy uptake, as Galgalo was also mentioning. The research realized that, during the research, we realized that the policy uptake, no matter the keenness of the policy makers, we needed to make very specific efforts to in fact reach not just those who generally have access to such information, but also those at the frontline level dealing with the problem. And therefore, midway into the program, we worked with communicating some of the research findings during the law enforcement trainings. So that was a research component. And I think I'll just add very briefly that I wore 2 hats, and I also led with my colleague, Timothy Kimayo, we led the monitoring and the internal monitoring and evaluation component of the STRIVE program, which tried to follow a more quantitative and rigorous methods for assessing and attributing the extent to which the program was able to achieve its goals and objectives. But we also combined it with qualitative analysis as well. And I'm going to leave it there because I feel like, again, this is touching on the boundary of the evaluators. So yes, that's all for me. Thank you so much, Martine.
Yeah, thank you, Gayatri. Excellent. And just as Gayatri was saying, we felt that the M&E will probably come up with the external evaluators. So that's why we decided to focus on research for now. And I think that gave a really good overview of what we've done and what we've learned. So now let me hand over to the final speaker on this panel, who's our colleague, Matt Freer, who was the Preventive Communication Manager. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Yeah, as Martin said, I was the manager of the Preventive Communication strand of STRIVE 2. So I'll just start with a brief outline of what we did. I think the first thing to emphasize is the The nature of the activities was sort of pilot in scale and nature, so that meant that they developed over time, and we did a lot of learning as we went along. The starting point was thinking about the factors underlying recruitment and radicalization in Kenya, and thinking about media and communications interventions under two headings. First, the structural factors around historical conflict and grievances. And second, those individual incentives, including the search for belonging, meaning, and purpose. So the first part of Preventive Communications, which was seeking to work on those individual incentives, involved building communication capacity of mentors and mentees, those at-risk youth in the Strive mentorship program. And this is what we call strengthening the voice of the youth. And that involved working very closely with Hadija and her team. So the mentors and mentees were led through a series of activities, media and communications in nature, writing, filmmaking, film festivals, all sorts of different things, which focused all around bottom-up storytelling. We sought to build their capacity to be a communicator, using primarily the smartphone they already had in their pocket, and using that to explore their own sense of purpose and identity. It also involved supporting them with opportunities to have those stories shared in the Kenyan national media, in newspapers and online, and to be part of a social media campaign. And we encouraged them with a film competition and festival, and supported them with professional filmmakers. This element of strengthening the voice and participation of at-risk youth was bolstered with propaganda and media literacy training, which could also be called critical thinking skills. And this sought to help them to identify and ignore the manipulative and harmful aspects of violent propaganda. The second heading of Preventive Communications was tackling structural factors, and that involved training of local radio stations at the coast in Kenya in conflict-sensitive journalism. Here, the emphasis was on strengthening longer format reporting, and that meant a deeper dive into underreported social issues underpinning violent conflict. And technical training was focused on increasing the accuracy of reporting, diversifying sources used for stories, and avoiding inflammatory language. Reporting techniques look closely at how to include voices and perspectives of marginalized groups. In this case, that often meant the hard-to-reach youth living in slum or informal areas of Mombasa and neighboring counties. And it's worth saying that sort of developed from existing syllabus on conflict-sensitive journalism. So overall, it was about expanding the way that the media could report and discuss the conflict behind violent extremism, and beyond the narrow framing that comes out often a lot of media coverage of us versus them. So turning to lessons learned, I think there's one cross-cutting area which is worth mentioning, which is to try and understand overall what the problems in the media and communications environment are, beyond that of just the presence of terrorist narratives that contribute to violent extremism. So in our work on media, that meant understanding problems faced in reporting on this topic, the day-to-day challenges journalists faced, and some of the issues that the coverage that they did create spread around. And for youth at risk of recruitment and radicalization, that means understanding how well represented they are in the media already, and their opportunities they have for exploring their own personal meaning and purpose. Turning to lessons learned for youth in particular and those individual incentives, obviously working with at-risk young people is difficult and complex, particularly when it comes to media and communications. So first, it was paramount to protect their exposure through any media, which largely meant first and foremost, keeping off politics and controversial subjects. At the same time, stories around family issues, personal challenges and experiences, it turned out, did open up a lot of discussion, a lot of stories, and was more useful than talking about violent extremism per se. And perhaps the most significant lesson was that the process of considering and telling of those stories brought about a lot of impact, bringing in the wide range of communications activities and tools to help build that process and explore those stories, therefore became important. And this sort of new content meant some good partnerships with newspaper editors could be created, and stories could be shared on social media easily with many thousands of users. Nevertheless, it was generally difficult to bring at-risk youth to the media and the media to our youth in a sustainable way. We should not assume that at-risk youth are online a lot for many different reasons. But also it was difficult in terms of getting heavier weight, documentary type TV content on mainstream Kenyan media. So those structural issues were also apparent in the work with the radio stations. Constraints on news and media output in Kenya, particularly around security, as elsewhere, remain very difficult, even with the skills training and strengthening understanding of terrorism, violent extremism. But certainly getting the input of radio station editors and managers before the training and before designing the training, so that it was most relevant to their needs and circumstances, was really important. And in that regard, treating them as independent professionals, even if you might find faults with some of their coverage, very much helped that process. And then in the training itself, sharing knowledge and ideas from external observers, researchers, but also other journalists was very helpful. And helping them to think about terrorism's conflicts, which in many ways they are experts in reporting on, and look beyond official sources alone, and including voices from marginalized communities, proved to be very relevant. And providing external perspectives and information, particularly at the local level, helped provide new angles in reporting. And in conclusion, bringing journalists together to discuss openly amongst themselves about how best to report on such a complex and difficult subject bore fruit. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. That was really useful. We have the opportunity in a small break after our Q&A in like 15 minutes or so to see a couple of the movies that Matt talked about. So we are looking forward to sharing those with you. I just wanted to say, as we move to the Q&A, that all of these findings and lessons have been written up in a lessons learned report. So we will share that with you in an email after this meeting. So if you are interested, you can, revisit some of the things that have been shared, and of course a few more details. We have a couple of questions, and I would like to, encourage you to keep them coming. As I said, we have around 15 minutes until we have a small break and move into the next session. The first question we have is from a colleague called Thibaut Giralou. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. He's a project analyst with UNDP in Tunisia, and he makes a note about the work that UNDP did with regards to the journey of extremism. And essentially he's asking whether RUSI considered working both with the youth from the mentorship program as well as ISF, and I think that means international security forces, on dialogue activities. And I would say in this case, international is not as relevant. So I think I want to pose that question to Hadija, our mentorship manager, and to Galgalo, who was leading our law enforcement work, to reflect on this consideration of bringing the two sides together in a dialogue, how we did it and how did it work. So who should I ask first? Khadija, maybe you want to share a few thoughts on that first.
Yes, we did, though not under Strive 2. We had a sister project which was funded by a different donor. Under that project, we did bring the youth and the law enforcement officers together, where we could discuss different topics. We touched on the rights of the youth, where the police officers will take them through what are some of their rights as per the Constitution. And also the police officers were able to share what's their role, what's their mandates, what are some of the also challenges they're facing as police officers. And we had also sessions where they could share on the experiences, both positive and negative, just to bring to humanize the police, since the youth feel, the police officers are like untouchable or not human. So yes, we considered, and if we are to do this again, if there's another component we should add, is this component of police youth dialogue. And my colleague Galgalo can add to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much, Khadija, for that explanation. I think what I can add is, of course, I also took part in that project, and in total we did 18 dialogue forums in 3 counties, and yes, the mentorship, the mentors and mentees were involved in this sister project called Street Mentorship. And I agree with you that it has a lot of significance, the relationship between the law enforcement and the youth. Of course, I cannot really say the extent to which the negative relationship has pushed these youths to joining violent extremism. But one thing that was quite clear was the us versus them mentality between the 2 groups. And of course, that has had a lot of impact on the general security, and particularly, motivations towards radical views. There is a report that we've written on that, and I'm happy to share with you for an expanded lessons learned from that project after this.
Yeah, great. Galgalo, he actually wrote an article on this discussion, so please get in touch and we'll make sure you get the link. We have another question from Sarah Gibbons, who worked with Mercy Corps. She's asking, how did you define measurement of success under the mentorship program? What measures of change were you looking to achieve, and how did you determine if you had contributed to that change? So this question is, of course, kind of an M&E question. So I really understand that you're asking it, because we didn't explain it as much. I think I want to give Gayatri the chance to reflect on that, and then I'm sure the evaluators will also bring some points on that. But before I do that, Gayatri, I can see that there's also a question from Nick Haley, and he's asking how many youngsters, so I would say mentees and mentors, took part of the initiative. And I know that you have those figures, so I just wanted to what do you call it? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and ask you to answer both of them. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, so the success of the program is a really good question. And what we tried to do was, we were looking at trying to unpack the resilience of youth. And while that is an oft-used term, we were trying to operationalize it, primarily looking at their attitudes towards violence, and then looking at certain other attitudes which are associated with positive youth development. That's a particular concept, and it covers aspects such as self-confidence, self-worth, and also critical thinking. And then thirdly, we were looking at their networks and trying to diversify networks and provide alternative networks, as well as provide support systems, as Khadija spoke about. And then we also looked at, fourthly, we looked at their knowledge and levels of understanding of VE and the drivers of VE and violence. And then fifth, we also touched upon looking at their connections at the community level and trying to see if they felt more connected to the community or not. And these are aspects, and then as the program further iterated, we also measured certain aspects, as Matt was talking about, with their levels of expression. And as we included aspects of psychological support as well, we looked at in trying to assess to some extent their levels of stress. So these were, a little bit of the 4 main criteria that I mentioned were the 4 main ones that we focused on. And then as the program developed, we did include certain other indicators. But because we followed a pre-post design format, we were able to measure the 4 quite consistently, whereas the others less consistently, because they emerged during once implementation had already progressed. And then to your question about how many people went through the program, so around 385 plus youths went through the program as mentees, and we had 42 mentors through the program.
Sorry, Gayatri, I can see that there's a quick follow-up, which also relates to the gender breakdown. Do you remember that part?
So I think the gender breakdown is around 70-30. 70%, 30%, 70% males and 30% females, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, great. I should also, advocate Gayatri and Timothy, our M&E team. They are publishing a paper on the impact, on the measurement and all of this. So those of you who are really keen on that, watch this space. More is going to come, and we are, keen on trying to write up some of the lessons we have learned in that area as well. Now I want to make sure Hadija is also ready because we have a question I want to try to answer together with Hadija. It's from a colleague who is asking, were there any challenges or lessons on engaging with at-risk youth from a security perspective? Were identities shared or screened by security and police? This is a really good question, and it's something we wanted to get right, because of course we were very mindful that we were not able to reach at-risk youth if they felt that through the program they would be more exposed to government than they already were. So this was really something we considered very carefully. And the way that we went about it, I would say, is that all of the mentors in the programs, they were screened from a criminal background perspective. They were no longer in, those who have been in crime, they were no longer in crime according to what we found out. So at least the mentors who were supposed to be, the leaders, they were out of crime. The mentees, we knew that some of them were in a gray zone, and we kind of knew that that's why they're relevant. And Hadija, I want you to add in a minute, but we always had the impression that we were able to see if somebody was drifting off track, and we did drop some mentees along the line because we felt there was too much risk associated with engaging with them. And we never reported any specific individual to any security colleagues. If we had known that somebody was essentially breaking the law, we would have found a way of sharing that information informally, but it never came to that, thankfully. But Hadija, maybe you want to add something, because you're the one who've been managing this on a daily basis.
I think you've said it all. There was limited involvement of government. We just involved them to guide us through which areas to target, and also to acquire the necessary permits when we are carrying out, the activities within those neighborhoods. This is just, as Martin said, to reduce the risk of government surveillance, also ensure that, the youth don't lose interest and trust in us.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe just to add to that, one thing we have discussed would be, if we were to do this again, whether we should include chiefs, so the most local part of government, in our referral system. So learning from other programs, like for example, the Boston approach and a couple of other places, they have local level government officials who can refer individuals into the program, but then they kind of let it run the course. And you know, we think that that might be a way of accommodating this so that government officers could also, after having understood the selection criteria, could refer people into the program that they think would benefit from being a part of it. But thank you for the question. Let me see if we have others. Yes, I think we just have time for one more, and that will go to you, Galgalo. I think regarding capacity building in law enforcement, the numbers of women were very low. Was there anything in retrospect that could have been done to have a more female police officers involved? I think you partly answered, but yeah, please elaborate, Galgalo.
Yeah, and unfortunately, partly is because of maybe the government policy of posting, you know, these middle level managers or senior level managers to different places. I wouldn't really say much about that. But what I can say is knowing very well that going into conflict affected areas, you are likely not to get the gender representation that you would want. It is important to proactively come up with criteria, for instance, for getting, you know, targeting the mid-level managers as we did. You know, we had defined together with National Counterterrorism Center that mid-level security and law enforcement managers would mean, you know, all the heads of security departments at the sub-county levels. Now, this was a very specific definition of the target group that we were looking for. Now, we went with that and we could not get the gender representation that we wanted. So my suggestion was, or rather is, to have a second kind of criteria, particularly for including women, that would even allow, you know, to go either lower than that to get women involvement. But again, as we have to accept some realities that even going lower, you might not find, you know, women representation at even the frontline levels. Yeah, I think it's a reality that any program or programming process should live with.
Great. We have two more questions, and I think I'm going to bring Judy's question into the next session. So Judy is asking if we can explain more about what we expected with regards to attitudes towards violence. I think hold that thought and we'll take it up in the next panel. And then we have a quick one that I can just handle quickly before we show the videos. So Amelia, this is that small cue that soon will need the videos. So Esther is asking, hi Martine, you've mentioned that you had to drop some of the mentees due to certain factors. What were the process guiding this, considering that youth involved are already vulnerable, and what does that mean for their rehabilitation, if I may put it like that? Thank you for that question. This was really, really difficult for us. And I must say that within the team at the time, we didn't entirely agree. So what Hadija mentioned before was that we have a kind of case management approach to this, in the sense that mentors and mentees, they develop individual plans with the mentees. And the idea is, of course, they break down goals for the mentees that they work around as the process goes. So it was certainly not something that came out of the blue. It would come because mentors are struggling perhaps to reach and to get the mentees to commit to the process, to engage. And perhaps we could not observe the commitment and the changes that we had intended. I should say that the mentees are entirely vulnerable. They never received any stipend from us. But they did receive, for example, a meal when we had long meetings or refreshments. So, you know, that was the incentive that were there. And that actually means something for this particular population, that they know that they have a meal a day when they come to the meeting. So a couple of guys were disruptive to the program. They were, for example, communicating inflammatory messages, not necessarily VE, but more just disruptive, and they came to the meetings high, either on weed or on drugs or other things. So you are right that they certainly need support, but we felt that it was not possible for us to manage them within the program at the time. Maybe I should add that we dropped a couple in the beginning, and I think we would have dropped less now because we learned as we went. And I'm not, I'm still not sure it was the right decision, but that was the decision we made at the time. So yeah, they were disruptive to the process and we felt we couldn't handle it at the time. So thank you for the question. Yeah, I want to make sure we answer Judy's question, so I'm bringing that behind the ear of Emily, who will chair the next session. What we're going to do now is to have a quick break for those who need it, as we show a couple of the films that Matt mentioned, and I think he also talked about the sensitivities. These two movies are not so sensitive, and they were shared quite widely and with the consent of the people in them. The first movie is just a nice small movie that shows kind of how smartphone filming is done and why it's important. And the second movie is a film made by one of the mentors from Miss Lee, and she as a part of the program. So after those two movies and this short break, our colleague Emily will lead the conversation forward and the final Q&A. So thank you so much for now and for listening, and I hope you enjoy these movies.
Si wote upiga selfies.
Ni easy kutengeneza videos.
Si costly, ni cheap.
Ni poa pia kufanya kitu fulani deeper na hizi simu zetu.
Mimi nimetoka area ya Majengo na mimi ni mentor. Hiyo area ya Majengo tuna interact sana na mayouth. Tunawa mentor, tunaonyesha ile design mnaweza fanya kitu positive na life yenu.
As mentors tuli participate in training fulani ya filmmaking. Tulifundisha kutengeneza films kwa sound na editing. Haikuwa kitu ngumu na tulimake films kadhaa. I think between Nairobi na Mombasa tulimake films ka 50. Ka utell story yako, watu haizijua ile tunapitia. Tulitengeneza films tukitia stories zetu, stories za wenzetu, emotions zetu, zile vitu tusipitia kwa mtaa.
Okay, so back to my story. That wasn't my story. I'm Diana Faustin, born and raised in Isili in a family of 4. We were raised by a single mother who means the world to us. I mean, she's our motivation and the reason.
Hizo videos ambazo tulitengeneza zilikuwa zinaongelea kuhusu experiences ambazo sisi kama mayouth kwa community tuna face, na vile tunaweza zitatua pia.
Kushoot video, I need a lot of money. In fact, I need any money. Tukafundishwa zile software tunatumia kama Power Director, Action Director.
Ukishachukua video yako, una edit kwa Action Director, unaanza kuedit from the beginning mpaka mwisho.
Mambo ya sound, voiceovers, majina, introduction, unaweza zituma through WhatsApp, through Facebook, unaweza zicompress. Hizo software zilikuwa very easy kutumia.
Jambo na karibu, kwa majina naitwa Sharifa Ibrahim. Leo tunaongelelea masuala ya election.
Ni free ku download, Play Store na download. All you need is time na inspiration.
Ningependa kuencourage vijana wengine pia watengeneze vitu kama hizo, ikuwe kama way of kupatiana voice yao. I think ni a medium na ni a platform high cost kitu yote na ni kitu rahisi na inasaidia sana.
I'm a planner, at least I try to be. I make lists, I make resolutions, I mark my calendar. I even scribble my goals in my notebook. Well, let's say my plans work out. Sort of they do, but not clear of all difficulties and challenges. Okay, so back to my story. That wasn't my story. I'm Diana Faustin, born and raised in Isili in a family of 4. We were raised by a single mother who means the world to us. I mean, she's our motivation and the reason I want to wake up each morning. I want her to feel the results of her hard work and determination in raising us. So I was born in poverty, like real poverty, where each day was a struggle for survival, where there was no chance for a better future, where missing meals was normal. But I desperately dreamt of a better life in my future, and I wanted to lead a life that was full of fulfillment. I wanted wealth, I wanted luxury, and wanted all that a poor kid will dream for, like good food, a good bed, a good room, PlayStation, a good TV, a very big TV, a very big house, and all that stuff. So I made a plan for myself, and I decided that I will focus all my energy on my education because I believed it would be the road to all my desires. It wasn't easy considering that we didn't have resources, we didn't have anything, but my parents really tried. My mom tried, and I felt like giving up almost all the time, but she will just get me back up my feet. I don't know how she does it, but she always did. I ended up going through primary successfully and secondary, and I'm now in university, and I will say it's all thanks to her. It will take time, I know, to get to what I dreamt of as a kid, but now I'm all grown up and I see life in another perspective. With the experiences that I've had in my life, I have learned that all the superficial stuff and every poor child's desire that I once had and was so important to me no longer is. The daily struggles are still there, and there are times you want to give up, but you remember you have to make it. You have to live that life that you want, because right now I love my life even more. I have understood how life is, its courses, and I'm all about positivity. I want to be a family person. I want to be one with full of love and everything to give. I want to be fulfilled not about wealth and luxury, but my heart's desires are fulfilled and met. I just want to be happy. Right now I'm living life and seizing the day's opportunities. I have a job, I have made friends, and I don't know if I will need anything more. I have a good relationship and I'm really eating good food. Yeah, I'm 100% thankful.
Good morning, good afternoon, and I hope welcome back to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the videos that we've just been shown. My name is Emily Winterbotham. I am the director of RUSI's Terrorism and Conflict Research Group. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this second session. This panel, as has been discussed earlier, is going to focus on the findings of the external evaluation team. Martine mentioned, but it's worth, I think, reiterating, the evaluation is going to be publicly available and will be shared after the event. And there is also a lessons learned report, which is available. I'm particularly delighted to be chairing this session because I think it will contribute to more openness and sharings of lessons learned in the PCVE space. Those of us who work in this area know that the field is increasingly criticised for having limited evidence of success and poor and insufficient M&E systems in place, which is why I think the Strive team and the external evaluation team have done such a good job to actually have a rigorous evaluation to, I hope, to move this conversation forward in terms of what is working and also what isn't. RUSI generally has been doing a lot of work in this space to build the evidence base for PCVE, but it really was the Strive program that led the way on this. So the team with the EU's support has been committed to contributing to the goal of knowledge creation and contributing to learning in this space. And a little bit of a pitch for another Strive program. We have a Strive program that we're implementing now in Afghanistan, and we've been extremely lucky to benefit, I think, from the learnings of the RUSI Strive program. So thank you to all of the team for their hard work over the last number of years, which I really do think is improving the knowledge base for PCVE in this field. I also therefore want to thank the excellent evaluation team for their comprehensive review, for their way of engaging in the community, and for their helpful recommendations. So I'll briefly introduce the evaluation team and then hand over to them. So we have Dan Range, who is an evaluation expert, specializing in understanding the impact of social and security policy interventions. He has lots of experience in monitoring, evaluation, and learning consultancy, including in youth mentoring, capacity building, faith-based interventions, and PCVE. He is currently completing his PhD in social psychology linked to trust and intergroup prejudice. Then we also have Professor John Cudahy, who I'm not quite seeing on the screen in front of me, but maybe is arriving later, who is a visiting professor at Coventry University at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and an international consultant operating in the fields of PCVE, counterterrorism, and organised crime. John has 30 years of experience in law enforcement, including as the head of counterterrorism for Police Scotland. John led the review also of Contest in Scotland, making recommendations to government about the need to situate PVE, or Preventing Violent Extremism, within a wider violence reduction strategy. And then last but not least is Tom Fisher, who is an evaluation specialist working over the last 10 years in this area. He's spent the last 5 years specializing in PCVE, including being commissioned by the UK Home Office to lead the evaluation of the UK's Prevent strategy. He is also the Programme Director of Coventry University's Master of Public Administration in Global Diversity Governance, and is completing a PhD in Sociology and Political Science on evaluation, knowledge production, and research impact. So just before turning over to the team, I would like to remind you of some of the house rules for this event. The entire proceedings, including the Q&A, are on record. We will leave time at the end for the Q&A. I know that we've had a question carried over from the previous session, but if you do want to ask questions throughout, please look at the, please ask them in the Q&A function, and I'll be monitoring that. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Dan to kick us off. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. Cheers. So we wanted to start by just giving a thank you to RUSI for the commitment to evaluation and monitoring that they have. It made our job much more straightforward to be working on this program and looking for impact in a program that systematically records data and does it in a credible way, looking at the correct factors which build resilience and look to combat the drivers of violence. It's much harder to do that on a program where the team which are delivering the work don't know what they should be looking for. So often our first piece is to come in and to fact check that, to make sure you are looking at the right things and you're recording the right data. So our first piece of work with the program in all aspects of it was to do that, and we found that the data was being recorded in a really good systematic way. That made our lives much, much easier. To talk about mentoring specifically, then I'll move on to Tom and John to cover their areas. Gayatri and others already covered that the program is designed in a way to engage with grassroots young people at risk of radicalization in Kenya. Therefore, we immediately saw that the idea of using mentors and mentorship is entirely appropriate. If you've got young people on the fringes of society that are mistrustful of government and authority, then you don't use government and authority figures to reach out to them. By drawing mentors from the same communities or similar communities to which the mentees are coming from, and although slightly older, have similar life experiences, this builds a level of trust between mentors and mentees and enables that relationship to start to develop. Similarly, the model of drawing the stakeholders from the same communities is impactful too. To do this work effectively, you need that localized knowledge. You need the real grassroots stuff which can be brought to it. By taking local stakeholders, giving them training and skills to identify the people at risk and to refer them, this built up that pool of local knowledge and local networks. So that is a real plus for the program. It's enabled people in Kenya to carry on doing that work beyond the program. It adds to the sustainability of the program and it builds that capacity. That's going to last well beyond Strive, and we saw in some of the data that came out that mentors, mentees and stakeholders have grown their networks and that they plan to continue to stay in touch and to maintain those after the program is finished. That is a really good impact for it. Similarly, talking about stakeholders, we saw that there's a very clear criteria for referrals. So one of the things which came up constantly when we was documenting this program was that there's demand for the program. Young people want to be on this program. They refer their friends to it. They ask if their friends, if their family members can join too. Having a very clear criteria means that you continue to have to justify why people are on the program, and you can evidence why people are. It takes that element of moves that element of like nepotism or grift away from it, and ensures you're hitting the right people. We felt that was really important, and that having very prescriptive guidance was very good there. Also, that mentors and stakeholders generally have some CVE or community background, and relevant life experience was important. You know, there's no point running a perfect mentoring program if you're attracting the wrong people. You need to have that relevant life experience and knowledge to be able to get the right people. Thanks a lot to the help of Hadija and her team on the ground in Nairobi and Mombasa. We were able to go out and meet some of the mentors and mentees, which is something that's not always possible on CVE programs, but really added to our understanding of the work and gave us confidence that the program was working with young people at risk and young people who've often had traumatic life experiences and who've got first-hand knowledge of the issues we're looking at, often on the edge of criminality too. So we were very reassured by doing that work and meeting with people that this is in the right place, and also that the program works for them. You know, what we found over and over again was that the program gave young people structure. The idea of having bi-weekly meetings across the city gave young people a structure and something to look forward to, something to aim towards every 2 weeks, and it built them networks across the city and got them out of their immediate neighbourhoods. So we talked, it was mentioned earlier about, you know, the sort of element of were there problems within the cohort, were people removed from it? We found there was a big element of self-policing because people valued being on the program and knew that there were behavioural standards that had to be adhered to. So the bi-weeklies, we immediately saw as being a potential flashpoint, bringing together 60, 70 or 80 at-risk young people every 2 weeks across the city sounds like a recipe for disaster. But actually, because of that strong cultural identity of being part of the program and the identification with it, young people by and large policed themselves and they behaved at these events because they valued being there. So there was a real, that for us evidenced a real sort of value of the program. So quickly to touch on some of the impacts, having 6 minutes to talk about this aspect of the program really isn't very much when we could really talk all day about it. We think the bits which really came out were that the program did bring about attitudinal and behavioural changes to people. And it's the attitudinal and behavioural changes we want to see. So one which jumped out was at the start of the program, in the baseline data, nearly 20% of participants felt that security services were the main cause of problems in their local community. And these are at-risk young people on the fringes of society. By the endline data, this has dropped to 7%. So not only is this a real attitudinal change in terms of behaviours and who we've influenced, these are young people who are going to be seen as being credible in their peer groups. So if they begin to say, actually, maybe the police aren't the problem, maybe the army isn't the problem, and they say this to their peer groups, that's a message that we listen to. They're a credible voice in their community. So that we felt was really impactful, and that was a key sign. And they can advocate for this work to carry on as well in that way. We also really, really saw firsthand that the economic impact of the program has been really important to a lot of the young people. So we saw average earnings of participants go up from just under 4,900 Kenyan shillings a month to 6,500, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but when that's all you have, that makes a big difference to people's life opportunities. And it gives people, there was a feeling it gave people something to lose as well. People behaved in a different way because they had opportunities and they could see further opportunities coming from this. Similarly, people felt a sense of pride at often earning legitimate income for the first time and from being involved in the program and with other NGOs. So a quote which came up was that a young boy in Mombasa felt that he had a greater sense of self-worth now because he's been chosen to be on the program. He's good enough to be part of a RUSI program. And if the Kenyan Red Cross want to work with him, then why can't he approach future employers and say, I'm good enough for the Red Cross, so why not good enough for you? That was a confidence which wasn't there before. We really felt that came out as being a strong part. And yeah, I mean, just to wrap up, really, we could talk all day about different impacts. So I look forward to the questions, but these are the bits we felt were really impactful: the attitudinal behavioural changes and the life opportunity. It was a really good strength of the program that what was being recorded at the start and what RUSI were looking for in baseline, midline, endline data was relevant to the program and relevant to the push and pull factors of CVE. Okay. John, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, sure, Dan. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good morning, good afternoon, or indeed good evening, depending on which time zone you're operating. Apologies for the delay in getting here. I was actually in Indonesia in the last hour, and it just demonstrates the environment in which we're operating just now. So, but it's a pleasure to be here. And at the outset, thank you so much to the RUSI team, and in particular, those on the ground, Gilgalo and Timothy, for making our job so much easier. And it's quite apparent that they have developed relationships that have enabled us to engage effectively, which results in, I hope, has been an in-depth evaluation. As each of you, I'm sure, will be aware that Strive is a brand in its own right. However, continues to be enhanced through involvement of RUSI and the delivery of programmes co-produced and co-delivered along with identified partners. Indeed, the programme that we have engaged here and that we have evaluated has been delivered in the face of various challenges. Challenges in terms of the threat profile, challenges in terms of the geography, the structures, the relationships, and indeed the culture, but specifically cultures within organisations. Strive 2, the law enforcement result area, constitutes the development and delivery of a training programme for Kenyan security and law enforcement. It's been delivered to senior and mid-level officers through the provision of the 4 training modules, but each linked and anchored within the curriculum piloted under Strive 1. Significantly, the result area operates in line with the training and the capacity building pillar of the National Strategy to Counter Violent Extremism, and although officially not approved by the Director of NCTC, has been endorsed for the delivery by senior NCTC leaders. Important, the multi-agency training sessions were designed within a human rights and indeed the rule of law framework that strives to strengthen national CVE approaches. And together we have found a substantial change in attitudes and application from law enforcement of soft power solutions over hard power actions. There is absolute clear evidence of an understanding of the impact and implications for vulnerable members of society, particularly those young people, when hard power solutions are applied by law enforcement. Indeed, those engaged in the training programme have illustrated throughout an absolute pendulum swing in their responses to the questionnaires that we posed. The training has created a shift from support for actions that have resulted in the removal of liberty, and in some instances, injury, and indeed the loss of life, to ones of community engagement, to disruption and preventative measures to protect those exposed by violent extremists, and indeed to prevent their exploitation. Such recognised indicators of effect demonstrate the effectiveness of the training programme. The acknowledgement that previous activity breached human rights and the rule of law, pushing vulnerable members of society towards those identified threat actors, to me is remarkable and holds huge potential for a significant improvement in police-community relations. From the very significant volumes of the data, the rigorous data that has been available to us and triangulated through our evaluation, the training has become a significant part of a movement that is enabling a change in the position of law enforcement from one of a causal factor in violent extremism to an absolute positive influencer in the development of relationships and the building of trust between themselves and those young people. The pathway to success has been created through the safe spaces in which to interact with traditional and indeed non-traditional partners, and to engage an incremental learning curve of modular training, which is catered for the needs and the needs of the community that they serve. To achieve the success within such a challenging framework, where civil society organisations, certainly within Kenya, have never before been afforded such direct and such sustained access and influence, is, to me, impressive. To do this within a context in which changes in leadership, changes in interest, have influenced progress on a previously agreed curriculum, the shifted geographical areas of operation, and tested the strength of existing trust and confidence, to me simply underscores the success of the result area. RUSI, there is no doubt, has developed a solid foundation from which to continue this work. There is a long way to go in it, but with a wide range of security and law enforcement actors, and managed positively to influence organisational culture within security and law enforcement agencies. That being noted, the challenges experienced within the law enforcement results area also serve to highlight the precarious nature of success in this field and with government partners. At the end of the programme, Strive 2, in my opinion, and indeed of those of my colleagues, can legitimately claim hard-fought successes, because none of this has been easy in influencing the structures which drive violent extremism. RUSI is a tried and tested provider with the trust of the recognised statutory authority for the coordination of CVE, the National Counter-Terrorism Centre, an important identifier and a hugely important strategic partner, as well as the trust of wider law enforcement structures. However, sustainable progress in this arena is reliant upon the fickle nature of political influence and interests, a prominent factor in any politically sensitive area of work, but particularly well evidenced during this evaluation. The successes achieved have come through perseverance, and it would seem sustainability hinges on future political dynamics. An important caveat to the insecurity, however, is that there is significant support from national, regional and local law enforcement changemakers for the continuation of this training programme, with a broadening out of beneficiaries to include front-facing practitioners and the centralisation and embedding of the Strive 2 curriculum within the Police Training Academy. It is very unusual for a civil society organisation to achieve strategic, tactical and operational support for a product which serves to educate and influence policing. Believe me, from a law enforcement professional, it is indeed impressive that this has occurred. There's an acceptance that law enforcement have been part of the problem in local communities, which is a very difficult, but for me a hugely important admission to make. And now with the innovation and creativity of RUSI, together with our partners, they can become an even more effective part of the solution, delivering a sustainable community policing model that impacts the lives of the communities in which they serve. Hopefully, within the time allocation, Emily, then thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. So I think we'll hand over to Tom to wrap us up.
Good morning, everyone. So just to finish the comments on the evaluation, I'm going to cover the final two result areas that you'll have heard about in session one. So I'm going to cover preventive communications led by Matt, and then I'm going to cover the research area as well, which Gayatri talked about earlier. So starting with preventive communication, in our evaluation report, we've split it into two areas of focus. So the first bit focuses on the training that's been provided to radio professionals around countering violent extremism and conflict-sensitive journalism. So I'll talk about that first, and then the second bit is the strengthening voice of young people. So in the radio training, well, firstly, what I should say is that, as Matt said, these were iterative things. They were pilots based on largely new and novel concepts. So unlike the two areas that my colleagues have talked about before, the impact assessment needs to be slightly different. So when you're evaluating a pilot, you need to be looking at whether these have worked enough to be considered for scaling up. And thankfully for us, the answer is in both is a resounding yes. It's very much easier to evaluate programs that work than those that don't. So for the radio professional training, what we found is that radio professionals on the coast of Kenya seem to be a largely untapped market of potential CVE actors. So the group that have attended the training and then had the mentoring afterwards, within that group, there was a significant will to change and to be part of the solution. There was a ready acknowledgement that there are gaps in their knowledge around violent extremism. There are gaps in their coverage and possibly flaws in their coverage around violent extremism, terrorism, and community issues in general. So that group then went through training sessions and mentoring sessions from a highly qualified media professional who worked with them one-to-one to create packages to go on air based on the training. So what we found as a result of those interventions is that there were very similar changes in that group as those that were found in the law enforcement trainees that John's just spoken about. So the trainees in the radio professional group were able to see young people in a very different way, in a much more humanized way. They were very much more in favor of engaging with the community. So the standard really in that field had been, when there'd been an attack or an event, a violent extremist event, was to go to state actors or police actors, law enforcement actors, for comment, and that would be most of the story. And after that, there was a significant change and a huge shift in the way that content was created around that theme. We had the opportunity to spend time in one radio station on the coast, and we've written a case study based on that. And effectively, that case study shows that there were 2 staff members that were trained and had mentoring and produced packages. And both of those trainees, by the time that we'd got there, had left and had taken up different jobs. And so we were a little bit disappointed when we got there that we wouldn't be speaking to the people who'd directly been on the training. But what we actually found was that those trainees, before they'd left, had done some training with their own staff and had significantly shifted the culture, I would say, of that station. So that radio station now engaged with the community much more around all issues, including violent extremism. Had a much stronger understanding of terrorism and violent extremism as concepts, and we're covering those issues more, and we're approaching, we're making much more effort to involve young people in particular in their programming, despite the fact that the people that had been trained had left, and that to us showed huge potential and huge sustainability for that program. So just this small pilot, this one-off training that had been delivered, had left with that legacy, which is, I think, a sign of both the efficacy of the training, but also of the readiness for that group to be trained and to become part of the solution. And finally, on the radio training thing, one of the standout factors was this use of conflict-sensitive journalism as a way of getting to journalists and talking to them about CVE. So conflict-sensitive journalism as a tool, as a concept, seemed to be this really good translation tool of showing violent extremism and terrorism, not just as a security issue, but also as a community issue that needed to be covered in a particular way. Then next, I'll talk about strengthening voice of youth or young people. This took us a while to get our head around, because again, it was a very iterative program. It developed over time and changed course along the way. And there are two facets to it. There's the impact that we can see from what we're calling self-expression activities, so people sitting down and telling their stories. And there was real impact from that. And then there's the impact from the outputs of that. So eventually that led to the production of videos, as you'll have seen there, and also newspaper articles that were actually published by leading Kenyan newspapers. So from the self-expression side, what we found was that that there was significant revelations, I guess, around the common experiences of mentees, but also mentors, of trauma and real difficult experiences in their past. So common themes around grief, violence, abuse, criminality, social isolation, and suicide. And those all came out in the room in a discussion. And for many, it felt like that was the first time that those had been shared in a structured and safe environment. That in itself should be seen as a positive impact of the program. And that seems to have led, although there is, because it's a pilot, slightly more limited data, that seems to have led to real significant impact for the individuals that have shared that information, but also on creating a positive group identity forged around these common experiences of trauma. There is limited data on that, but from all signs at the minute, it seems like that in itself is an incredibly valuable exercise and should really be considered as part of the mentorship program, which Dan spoke about at the start there. And the final one on this is just to finish with a recognition of the challenges which Matt touched on earlier, is that these activities eventually led to articles in newspapers and videos that were originally designed to be aired on national Kenyan television. The latter there didn't happen. So the real success is that newspaper articles were published in leading Kenyan newspapers, but the videos that were designed for television didn't happen, and that's purely because of this really big structural barrier in getting media aired, in getting content aired on Kenyan television, and getting the attention of media institutions. So there's quite a lot written in the report about how that could be overcome in the future. And then very quickly, I'll just wrap up with the smallest part of the program, but by no means less important. The research element. So as you'll have heard from Gayatri, the research was published in 4 areas as it was intended. Actually, we found that far more research was produced than originally planned because of this partnership with the French Institute of Research in Africa, which has reaped many, many rewards. The research was done in revelatory and completely new areas that had never been covered before, which is fantastic. And most of the impact of the research came from where there was the greatest depth of research, which is a relatively obvious thing to say. So particularly in the research on the role of women in violent extremism, most of the impact from this result area sat within that, because there were several publications within that theme, which led to a body of work which people could then become attached to and recognise as substantial. That very unusually seems to have led to tangible impact. So as a direct result of that research being published, there is now a new network on gender and CVE in East Africa, run by one of RUSI's partners. It's been used by the International Security Sector Advisory Team in their training, and shows potential to be used by lots and lots of other actors in this field. And we feel that most of that is because the research is of very good quality, and there's a lot of it in one particular area. That's worked really well. The final bit of impact on that is that the capacity of researchers in Kenya in the field of CVE has been greatly developed. Those that have worked with RUSI have got more skills, more profile, more dissemination, more research to their name. But that's come at a cost. And this is my final point, I guess. The cost in all of this is that RUSI had to put in significantly more work than they had originally intended in order to bring the research up to a high enough quality to be published. So that's involved mentoring support, editorial support, copy editing, support around methodology. There's been a lot of support there to bring this research and the researchers up to the level that RUSI felt was they were able to publish in. I think that's probably enough. I'm happy to turn over to questions.
Thanks, Tom. And I think very important point to make at the end, that actually a lot of this work requires blood, sweat and tears from the teams involved, and a lot of free work most of the time as well, to really support a good program. So thank you for making the point. I will now open the floor. We've got about 15 minutes at a push for questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function. Conscious that we had a question from Judith in the last session about talking about attitudes towards violence. The question was, can you explain in more detail what you expected and what you found about attitudes towards violence? And perhaps I could turn that to the evaluation team, and then it may be that Gayatri wants to follow up as well regarding her impressions.
Yep. Tom and John, do you mind if I take this and you jump in? Yeah. Okay, so I think it's a really good question, Judith, and I think the important distinction to draw at the start is to define violence and what sort of violence we're looking for here. So the programme is looking really at political violence and extremist activities. But obviously it's working with a cohort of young people for whom casual violence is much more normalised than you'd expect to see in general population. Most of the young people we met and we spent time with were young people who had seen very traumatic things and been involved firsthand in very violent acts often. So the attitudes to violence there were different to what you'd normally see. But we did see over the course of the programme and in the data, we saw a shift towards participants, both mentors and mentees, having a much deeper understanding of the drivers of political violence and extremist activities, what the red flags were to look out for in your peer groups and your colleagues around it, and what the dangers of these were. So there was a real growing depth of understanding from the participants about what political violence is, what extremist activities are, and how people are drawn into them. As part of the growing group identity around the peer groups of mentors and mentees, there was a new normalization of standards. So if you want to be a part of this group and you want to continue to be a part of this strive to subculture, you have to adhere to the group norms, which is, you know, moving against the ideas of political violence and extremist activities. So we saw a real softening of attitudes towards violence. People were turned off by the idea of violence and felt less inclined to engage in it. But we did still see that there was, you know, the young people in the environment they live in, there was a much more casual attitude to violence than you would see in most young people. Tom and John, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, if I may, from a law enforcement perspective, it's a very interesting question indeed. And first of all, it's about the understanding not only of what violence is or what violent extremism is, but also the impact that violence has on violent extremism. And certainly from me in the engagement with law enforcement, there was an acceptance of levels of violence in pursuit of national security. But through the development of the training, a greater understanding that those levels of violence that were enacted in the name of national security were having a detrimental impact, not only in the fact that it was a breach in their human rights, but also acted as a driver to those engaged in violent extremism. And from some of those from the prison estate, there was a lack of understanding of the difference between violent extremism and violence per se, and their acknowledgement that individuals within the prison estate were actually incarcerated for violent acts, but not in relation to violent extremism. So an understanding of what violence actually is hugely important, and as part of the training was an attempt to distinguish one from the other. But also for me, that it was that impact of violence at the hands of law enforcement in the recognition and acceptance that the levels of violence at times were absolutely unacceptable, and that change in culture was hugely significant to note, in the acceptance on the part of those within law enforcement about engagement and through community policing was far more effective than not. But a hugely important question, and thanks for that.
Thank you. I didn't know. Oh, sorry, Tom. Did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to say I think my colleagues have covered it perfectly well, so I'll shut up.
Great, Gayatri. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, not really. I think the only thing I would say is that we did measure it through a scale, and we asked people their justification for violence, in which context do they feel that violence is justified. And we gave them a number of scenarios, and they picked, and they basically picked the scenarios where they felt that violence is justified or not. And the ones where they didn't pick any scenario was the ones that we said didn't really support violence. That's it.
Great, thank you. So we've got a couple more questions. And the first is from UNDP, which is on the research component. Did you evaluate to what extent research findings have been used by government or development actors to inform their policies and programs? So was that a component of what you were looking at, I guess, in the evaluation?
Yes, it was. So we looked at whatever evidence was available that that the research had an impact on basically anybody. And so the two main groups would be government actors, who are notably harder to influence because of the role of politics and the multiple factors involved that go into policy decisions. It's not just evidence, and I think we all know that. And then the other group is NGOs, international NGOs, any aid development agencies, that sort of stuff. And as expected, the research has had much more tangible impact with the second group. And we found specific examples from two international agencies in particular who have picked up the research findings, used that to adjust their approach. And the example I gave there was the creation of the network on gender and CVE. That is a huge recognition that the research has been done. It's a huge important quality, and there's enough of it that a large international agency would change their emphasis and change their activity to recognise it within their work. So research impact is always incredibly difficult to measure because there's a problem of latency, that you have to wait for a long time for people to pick up the evidence and actually use it. And then there's a problem of attribution. People do things for many, many different reasons, and you have to attribute this tiny piece of research done in Kenya to this big change over here. And so, but very surprisingly, in the research, we were able to find a couple of really good good examples of where that's been used. The only thing I would say is that one of the recommendations in our report is that there should be more evidence collected in the next iteration of the program, or wherever it goes next, to understanding how the research is used, and probably some more face-to-face engagement with NGOs. I guess the critical success factor there is that the biggest impact from research came from what we call face work, from the one-to-one interaction between the researcher and the policymaker, so they can sell it, and less came from broadcasting, basically from big events, putting it online, that sort of stuff. So if you can invest slightly more in one-to-one relationships, then the RUSI brand is already there. That's an incredibly important factor. Then you will get more success from the research afterwards.
And can I just add to Tom's point on that around latency, that the report and our work is a snapshot in time, but the research is there to be used, and it's good research. So we would expect over time that the research gets picked up more and more. And that's something that RUSI should try and keep an eye on and try and track a bit more longitudinal work.
For myself also, I think there's an important distinction to be made in relation to the overall impact and what I would call indicators of effect. And one of the indicators of effect in the short term was that there was clear evidence that the research was dynamically disseminated and accepted by organisations. Whilst the impact of that research is still to be measured, but the fact that there was exposure of that research was hugely important, because you can't measure impact until such times if you had the exposure to the research. So the reach and again the branding of RUSI helped considerably in relation to that. But clear evidence in the short term that, particularly around the gender, that organisations had taken hold of that research and were thereafter considering it in relation to the shaping of their future policy.
Yeah, and that of course relates to the fact of the nature of projects, whether they're short term or longer term. You know, the fact that this was Strive 2, building on Strive 1, you know, demonstrates why it's important that PCVE programs are considered longer term projects, which actually was one of the key, I think, points that was made in the first Strive evaluation of the Strive Horn of Africa project. I've got two questions, but I'm conscious that they're more about the actual lessons from the overall project. And if you don't mind, then I'm going to take the advantage of having you in front of me, because I want to ask a question just about the evaluation. Because one of the things that I've noticed, and actually I've talked about with Gayatri, was about the measurement of mentorships and social networks. So one of the goals of the mentorship program to increase the number of social networks on the basis that, you know, radicalization is driven by issues of belonging and identity crises and all of these things. And yet, and Gayatri, apologies if I'm quoting your excellent paper with Timothy, which is forthcoming, it seemed that from some of the internal evaluation statistics that actually the creation of alternative social networks was not as significant, or we didn't see as much positive change in that regard. And the positive relationship between the mentor and the mentee was still the most significant aspect of the program. I don't know if that came out in your evaluation, and I hope that was understood in terms of the way I've just asked it.
Yeah, Dan, do you want me to go first and then you chip in?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Okay, so in the, I guess we talk more about group identity or group dynamics than about networks. But the internal stats that were developed focused on particular aspects that you could measure statistically. And I think there was some improvement, right, actually, but not enough to say statistically significant. What we found in the qualitative data, which was much more revealing in this area, is that there were very similar dynamics at play within when we ran a focus group, for example. There were very similar dynamics at play in the development of positive social identities within those groups. Very similar factors were at play, as would be at play within an extremist environment. So the program has effectively replaced the dynamics that those people would be getting from an extremist environment, from an extremist group online or wherever, and replaced it with a positive social identity as part of the program. So the qualitative data isn't enough to generalize effectively. Qualitative data rarely is. But what we saw is that there were some really strong group identities formed, which created norms around a norm to be legitimately employed and to employ your friends. It's a norm to act in a certain way without violence. It's a norm to share your emotions and your feelings with your friends in a particular way. That sort of thing came through very, very strongly from the focus groups. Dan, did you have anything?
No, I think you covered most of what I was going to say there, Tom, so thanks for that. No, I think what came through really strongly to us in meeting with the mentors and mentees was this real group identity idea. So often when you look at these programs, people take part in the program because they're on a program, it's not a big part of their identity. But we saw, speaking to the young people, that they really felt part of the program. They felt that it shaped their behavior, and that continuing to be part of the program and part of the group that the program brought them into, this kind of subculture that had been developed, was conditional on them adopting the positive behavioural norms and continuing to do them. I mean, one bit which really stood out, and I don't know if you remember this, Tom, was we were doing a focus group in Mombasa, and one of the young people had gone back to college, and the other 6 or 7 people in the group all just said they were really proud of him and gave him a round of applause. You know, that is real positive affirmation. And, you know, he said as a result of that, he's more likely to stick out with what he's doing. You know, that is what we felt was really impactful. It's a shame the data didn't show that in quant terms, because it'd been a really good thing to pull out. I think that's a bit of the program which could do with more research and a bit more digging, because I think that's where real impact is.
Thank you. I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. One just quickly, I think, from the evaluation team on your prognosis or your assessment of sustainability for this work.
Okay, it depends on result area. So overall, the program is entirely sustainable. For me, John, you might disagree, but for me, the most sustainable element of it is probably the law enforcement part, because of the way that RUSI has become almost embedded within structures. The training has been taken on and now has a life of its own. It's been used in environments beyond the program, which I think is really a really great thing. And RUSI, more than anything, as John had said, is a trusted player within that really tough environment, and has worked incredibly hard to make that happen. That's where the sustainability comes beyond the program. If you can build a trust with that actor, then that relationship carries the sustainability. I don't know if John or Dan want to answer anything else on sustainability.
Yeah, for me, and first of all, just to reflect on the last point, because it's connected, this is about trust. And the reason why the youth have engaged so well is because they trust not only the programme, but the mentors. And part of that was that they didn't feel compromised with their data being given to law enforcement. Initially, I would have questioned that, but having looked at the programme in its entirety, I think that was absolutely the most appropriate and right thing to do. But then you take the trust between RUSI and the partners, and a lot of this goes down to the relationship building, the investment between Gayatri and the team, like Gallo and Timothy. There is no doubt that trust is there, not only with NCTC, but also with the local county teams. And indeed, they commented on that. And they commented that RUSI and NCTC went to the border of engaging with them in the local counties to actually gain their thoughts. And that was the development of the relationships and indeed trust, which attracted their buy-in. But the manner in which to take this forward for me is to then embed this structure within the policing training and embed it within the national training curriculum. One of the challenges that we have found was a human resource issue, where often law enforcement move their staff regularly. And those that had been trained and considerable amount of time spent with them, all of a sudden had been moved for reasons known to law enforcement. But if we could actually take this training, which is tried and tested, and embed it within the training academy, the policing academy, and we actually catch those young recruits as they are leaving the academy and empower them in relation to this training, that would be huge. That would be sustainable and going forward. And I think there's an appetite for it. And it's all because of trust in the product and trust in the people going forward.
Okay. And I'll be really quick, Emily, because I know we push for time. With regards to mentors, mentees, and stakeholders at individual levels, they've got increased capacity, increased networks, and better economic opportunities as a result of the program. The program's finished; those 3 things are still there. That's sustainability for me at individual levels.
Thank you. And I should say that, you know, Strive 2 might be finished, but, you know, this is not the end of this type of activity from RUSI's side. And we are very, very keen to continue the excellent work that's been done. I'm going to hand over, though, to Lunia now, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to answer a few of the questions. We can follow up directly in person, but back to you, Lunia, to end this excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to the evaluators for participating in Gayatri in that last conversation. So I have the task of sort of wrapping up, but we have very little time, so I want to be conscious of the time that we have. So hopefully today you have learned a great deal more about the Strive 2 program from the managers that worked on the components of the program, their former team leader, the Deputy Director General of RUSI, as well as the EU program manager and the external evaluators. We hope that this event has been insightful, and we invite you to learn more about the Strive 2 program by visiting the RUSI.org website. So under the Strive 2 program, RUSI has produced a number of research pieces that have been referred to today, and we invite you to check out those research pieces on the RUSI website. Each piece of research has the goal of contributing to the evidence base on CVE in the region. And we also invite you to find the Strive 2 Lessons Learned report, as well as a recording of this webinar on the RUSI website. Also, I do want to mention that the forthcoming report that was mentioned, that's coming from Gayatri Sagal, as well as Timothy Kimayo, the M&E team for Strive 2, that will be also posted to the RUSI website. Finally, subsequent to this event, the evaluation report that the evaluators have just discussed will also be available through the CT Morse website. So before closing out the event, I again want to thank the European Union, all of the RUSI Nairobi team, as well as the London team that over the years have worked on the Strive 2 program. I also want to mention members of the Strive 2 team that have not been part of the event today that you're not seeing, to include Timothy Kimayo, Rukia Hassan, Fatima Hussein, Christine Okoko, Joyce Kamau, Diana Boke, the Africa Uncensored team, and several other people that I just don't have the time to mention today. Finally, I want to send a thank you to all of those that participated in Strive as mentors, mentees, stakeholders, or law enforcement trainees that worked with us. And a special thank you to the RUSI Events and Communications team, especially Amelia Markert, for making sure that we had a very smoothly run event today. And finally, a big thank you to the audience. Thank you for participating today and for your questions. And if you have the time next Monday on the 21st, at the same time, we would love for you to join us for another event related to the Strive program, which is focused on media development in preventing and countering violent extremism. Matt Freer, who is here today, will be participating in that, as well as myself. Again, thank you all so much for your time. And we hope that you've enjoyed this event and that you do go to the RUSI.org website to learn more about the Strive program, as well as the team and other RUSI CVE work. Thank you.